Hello, and welcome to the Full of Ship podcast. Real answers to real problems. With your host, Kyle Henderson, CEO and co-founder of Vision, a podcast dedicated to demystify the chaotic, often turbulent world of ocean freight. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Welcome to another episode of Full of Ship. I'm your host, Kyle Henderson, CEO of Vision. And today I'm joined by Ken Lyon. Ken, as we were just chatting a moment ago, you're a technology professional in international logistics, a very well-regarded career. Some notables: cover of Wired magazine in 1999, a nice stint at UPS throughout the 90s as well, seeing quite a bit of what the future was going to be as technology was brought to logistics. Thank you for joining us today, and maybe you could take a moment and give yourself a more appropriate introduction than I was able to.
Well, thanks a lot, Carl, and thanks a lot for inviting me. I've been working with technology in logistics and supply chain management for a very long time now. I started back in the early 1980s when I first came into the industry as a freight forwarder. And that was just as technology was beginning to penetrate the industry, mainly with the major shipping lines where they installed mainframes and things like that. But the technology revolution, even back then, this is way before the internet and personal computers were getting small enough to be installed in small companies. So the forwarding company that I work for, they wanted to get one of these things, and they didn't really have much idea. And because I could read and write at the same time, I was obviously the corporate intellectual. So they asked me to go and find out about this stuff. And that started me on a fantastic journey of discovery, which kind of has led me to where I am now. After I started to get used to what computers could do, I saw the infinite potential for transforming the industry. So I left the forwarder, went to work for a software supplier, then set up my own software startup with another guy. From there, UPS, who were just beginning their international expansion, came to Europe and by a happy accident literally bumped into me and asked me to join their European management team. And that was in 1990. And that led to 10 years of fantastic opportunities and some incredible mistakes that luckily people far brighter than me were able to resolve. But it taught me a lot. And halfway through that, myself and three other colleagues were invited by the management committee in Atlanta to establish a logistics business. And these days that's known as UPS Supply Chain Solutions. But it literally started as a thing called UPS Worldwide Logistics. And we built that pretty much from scratch into the global organization it is now. And we focused on using technology and very, very smart logistics operators rather than acquiring logistics businesses and trying to mold them into something that UPS would understand. We set it up as a separate business, and the technological foundation of that was pretty vital. And by 2000, that had grown to an enormous organization, and I was exhausted, constantly traveling around the world. We had operations in Asia, Europe, and obviously the US. And I was by then corporate vice president for all the information systems. And I just wanted to try something new. And that was at the height of the dot-com bubble. And a lot of people approached me saying, come and help us. And because I've got an ego the size of a house and the brain of a pea, I said, okay, let's give that a go. And as usual, my timing was exceptional because as soon as I got involved in a startup that I'd founded, raised several million in venture capital, the industry collapsed. but anyway, all these things are lessons. And since that time, that was in 2006. Uh, I've been working with various companies as either a non-executive director, an investor, or an advisor, helping them to try and make sense of how technology is applied in this industry, and really just trying to move things forward and hopefully guide people not to repeat the mistakes that I made. Make some of their own and learn from those. So that's pretty much where I am now. I spend most of my time as a non-executive director, sitting on the boards of various companies or as an advisor to various companies, all in the logistics and supply chain management space. Phew, that was a long monologue. Sorry for that.
Well, clearly quite the distinguished career.
Thank you.
Now, you were mentioning that startup that you pulled together at the height of the dot-com era, right before the bubble burst. And from the Wired article, I'm sure you get this brought up quite a bit. You said you had been incubating the idea for about a decade, and that means you must have been working on the idea back in the late 80s or so. Was that the transition from the firm that you were working with prior to UPS? Had you been sitting on this idea of we can really move everything to not just computers, but at some point the internet? Maybe you could tell me a bit about what you
Yeah,
saw could be done.
yeah. This sounds like it was designed, but it wasn't. It really was a happy accident, lucky accident. Um, Before I joined UPS, one of the people I worked with um, was a communications expert, network telecommunications expert, and also had a strong background in commerce, global commerce. So he understood banking, shipping, and insurance, and that these are the key ingredients for global trade. And he contacted me because of something that I'd written that had got published about the way technology was likely to transform the industry. Now, the industry back then, or the landscape back then, this was around the world, was nothing like it is today. You couldn't conceive back then what the world is like today. Um, the internet, as we understand it now, was still an experiment in DARPA, the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. So none of that was around. Electronic mail was just appearing on the horizon. In some American universities, you could access electronic mail, but anywhere else, that wasn't possible. And certainly in places like the UK, if you tried to use electronic mail, it was actually illegal because of the way it threatened telex revenues. Anyway, I digress slightly. But the company that I was working for, the little startup before I joined UPS, one of our customers was a major global shipping line, which doesn't exist now because it's been taken over, merged, and the ocean shipping landscape has changed dramatically. But they had lots of demand from their customers to see what was going on with their shipments. And back then, because technology was so primitive, the only way the shipping lines could do this, and they only did it for their major customers that spent tens of millions with them every year, was to actually give them a mainframe terminal in their office, which involved getting a dedicated leased circuit from the local phone company. I mean, it was just a nightmare. You laugh when you think what you can do now versus what you had to do then. But they were interested in visibility of where their containers were and what ships they were on. And the shipping line had their own people that fed information into their mainframes based on where those containers were. And the shipping line approached us and said, could you do this as a PC application? Because this is just when PCs were beginning to enter the market. And so we built something that did that. But again, it had to connect either to a dedicated leased line, which cost enormous amounts of money, or as an email attachment, a file showing what was in there. And the demand for this was phenomenal. And at that point, I thought, blimey, this is, this has got potential. But because the ocean shipping market was so competitive, when we went to suggest, well, maybe we could sell this to other shipping lines, the shipping line that asked us to do it in the first place were very unimpressed by that idea because they saw it as a competitive advantage. And that just coincided with UPS knocking on the door saying, hey, would you like to come and play with us? Now, to be fair, integrators, which is essentially what UPS is, along with Federal Express and DHL, they had, because they were handling millions of packages every day, very similar to post offices around the world. One of the ways they'd been able to operate a superior service and charge more money for it was because they were starting to develop their track and trace systems. Now, these systems, compared to what you get today, were pretty primitive, but back then they were an absolute revolution. That you could see where your package was by virtue of when it arrived somewhere, it was scanned, or when it left somewhere, it was scanned using a barcode. And when I was thinking what we'd done for these container lines, and then looking at what these track and trace systems could do. And by the way, to set up these track and trace systems was phenomenally expensive. Millions. They were far more extensive than anything any shipping line had or could afford for that matter. But for the integrated carriers, this was vital for them being able to offer a superior service and actually manage that service and performance levels. So I just, for me, it was just a natural evolution. Blimey, combine the data that you get from a shipping container with all of the items in that, which may be multiple packages, along with a global track and trace system. That was going to be a game changer. And then again, in parallel with this, the internet was starting to be commercialized because by 1990, you could actually, even if you had to use a dial-up modem, which most people wouldn't understand these days, but it's very similar to when you used to make an old-fashioned fax call and you had this weird chirping down your phone line. You could connect to a version of the internet using a dial-up modem, and then you were able to start moving information around in a similar form to the way you use today. So that was really where the idea germinated. And as I went through my time at UPS, and we were working with different companies, and particularly when we set up the worldwide logistics business, because that was based on information, the ability to leverage global track and trace systems and turn them into what we now call visibility systems, that to me was a no-brainer. Unless we could do this, we would not really be able to provide or build the kind of business that we wanted. A lot of people thought this was crazy. They said, why would you want to do that? I mean, track and trace is good enough. And we said, no, if you're managing a global supply chain and you need to know about where inventory is, have options if a shipment or a flight changes or a truck breaks down or something like that, you need to know everything about that shipment or that package or the items that are in that package and be able to reroute them and switch them. So that was really kind of where it came from. And that the point that you're alluding to that was in the Wired article, which was an organization called eLogistics that we set up because of the dot-com boom. We set that up inside UPS, thinking we could set this up as a sort of standalone and try and offer these services to lots of other companies. That was really where that came from, because data and information about shipments in real time would be a real game changer in the marketplace. So that was kind of where that was.
So many of the ideas behind e-logistics back in '99, inventory management, visibility, um, electronic markets for booking your freight,
Yeah.
dealing with, actually market priced freight versus fixed prices.
Yeah.
How much of what you guys were imagining back in '99 is real today? Feels like it's very close, or seems like it's still over the horizon.
Yeah, I sometimes I reflect on that, because you have to remember when we were saying these are the kinds of things that we would do or would like to do back then, there were no reference points. This was all an act of faith. Certainly, although we would the way we operated the organisation, we could pretty much do whatever we wanted. There were no constraints on us like that, which for an organisation the size of UPS was an incredibly brave thing to do, to allow these bunch of foreign renegades to try this weird, funky stuff. I mean, it was pretty revolutionary. But they let us experiment, as I say, and we made some huge mistakes as well. But we were also incredibly successful, and that was because we were lucky enough to get some very smart people that came and helped us to do this. But the things like real time spot rates, spot rates by definition are real time. Being able to have a real time view of inventory and all the rest of it. First off, the spot rate thing. When you're a freight forwarder, and this went back to when I first started in freight forwarding in the late 1970s, if you wanted to ship something somewhere, you phoned a shipping line and you got a price. And then you'd phone another shipping line on the same route and got a different price. They were just publishing these things as sort of on a daily basis based on bunkering, fuel costs, and a whole raft of other things. So that was the way the industry worked. The notion that you get these days with a rate card or a tariff, these are the rates for per box on these routes. It was all back then, unless you were shipping, I don't know, 500,000 boxes a year with a container, and by box I mean 20-foot or 40-foot container. Then you just sat down with the management of that shipping line and said, okay, this is what I want to pay, not this is how much you're going to charge us. But for the rest of us, or anybody else that just wanted one or two containers or even 10 containers, or they wanted to ship some cargo that didn't fit in a container, it was all spot rates, but it was all manual. So you phoned up, someone told you a price, you wrote it down on a bit of paper, you phoned someone else, you wrote that down on a bit of paper, and whichever one was the cheapest, then that was the one you picked. Now technology has obviously automated that alongside the tariffs and so on. Now, another point I should make is one of the in the UK, customs were pretty revolutionary here, that they allowed freight forwarders and shipping lines to connect directly to the customs systems to make customs clearances. This was in the very early 1980s. No one in the world was doing this. Even in America, with their ANSI standards emerging, they started to get into this stuff later than that, ahead of a lot of other people. But certainly in the UK, we were ahead of the world in doing some of this stuff. So the ability to connect and communicate, and it was very clunky how you did it, but that was a way of doing it. You ended up with, around seaports there were, and airports here, you ended up with communities of users, which were freight forwarders, airlines, shipping lines, all the parties that are involved in that, all being connected electronically to a bloody great big mainframe, um, operated by customs and or the port authority, that enabled you to do this. So you started to see this infrastructure being established where data could move around. And then there was a lot of hype, again, because of electronic mail and communications really being liberated from where they were. You ended up with a lot of this, what was called back then EDI, electronic data interchange. And there was an awful lot of nonsense and standard setting and everything else that sort of surrounded that. I sat on some of the message design committees, and if ever there was a shortcut to becoming a geriatric, that was the route to do it, because they were deadly boring. Most of the people involved in that had no idea what they were talking about. But you had some nice lunches in different parts of the world, so that was all right. But essentially, trying to move the industry forward in sharing information, that really, I would say that was more a bump in the road than actually opening up a new road, because technology has advanced so quickly. No one could imagine back then that it would move so fast, that information systems would become so cheap to do a lot of this stuff. So that was the sort of landscape that a lot of this stuff was evolving through.
I'm curious. So much of the experience you're relating is from your time at eLogistics, UPS, then later as non-executive director at a number of companies. Um, EDI is still alive and well in many different ways currently. And
Well, and I should
what
correct you there. When I left UPS and did the venture funded startup, we did that for about 6 years in all, and that was solely focused on supply chain visibility. And we built technology. We built what's now known as a cloud service. We actually built a cloud service back then because I was absolutely convinced that access to the internet would be um, as a utility service, in the same way you get water, power, and so on, gas. And so when I set up, the company was called Sorcery, um, and it was set up as a cloud-based business before the people actually knew what to describe, hosted services as cloud services. And everyone thought we were crazy, apart from one of our customers who happened to be Cisco. And I had an extremely good relationship with Cisco because at UPS Worldwide
they were
Logistics,
building the internet.
they were a big customer, and we did some really funky stuff for them back then, which was really, really groundbreaking and advanced for that arena. And Cisco remembered that, and they liked that. So when I said I was going to start up a visibility company, they said, "Wow, we're in. This is really interesting to us. What are you planning to do?" And unfortunately, our ambition exceeded what the technology was able to deliver. But we were able to establish a cloud service because Intel, the chip company, whenever they built a fabrication plant, they built a data center next to it. And their data centers were all exactly the same around the world. And they realized these things are incredibly expensive. Can we find another way of selling capacity that we have here? And I bumped into an Intel executive and said, I'm interested in building a solution that can run on someone else's infrastructure and provide that as a general internet service. And they said, wow, sit down, let's talk. Now, how we ended up doing a deal, and so they could replicate the technology we built in their data centers around the world so we could service a global customer base. And we focused on orders, inventory, and shipments and visibility around that. And we actually built the application. As I say, we did stuff with Cisco and so on, but unfortunately we couldn't scale it fast enough, and it didn't survive. But we pioneered a lot of this stuff, and I'm embarrassed how much we paid Intel per month to use their infrastructure to do this, because it was a silly amount of money compared to what you pay today. But that really, to my mind, it validated why visibility was so important for supply chain operations. And also, you've got to remember that the physical manufacturing world was changing from um, make stuff and then sell it to sell stuff and then make it. So, build to order just in time. That was really starting to take hold. And in that environment, knowing where your inventory is, knowing what your orders are and what the status is, and knowing where your shipments are was absolutely vital. And the only way you can do that is through really good visibility. And that hasn't changed. And to ultimately answer your original question, why has it taken so long? There was something I was reading the other day that it seems to take 20 years in some industries from something being a good idea, even if the technology is available then, for it to become adopted as a common currency. and that still surprises me that that's the case, but it seems to be the case. A lot of the stuff that I see now, the visibility companies that are popping up everywhere, they're not doing anything we didn't do at Sorcery. They're able to do it much, much cheaper and much easier because technology's evolved, and maybe they're better business people than we were. But what they're trying to do is not dissimilar at all. I could share with you some of the
The
presentations.
same fundamental problem.
Yeah, if I shared the presentations we made to our investors back then and compare it with some of the presentations you see from the big visibility companies now, they're identical. They're not just similar, they're identical. and
Yeah.
it's just the timing and everything else.
How much of today's marketplace landscape is about taking ideas that have been somewhat deployed, somewhat successfully to the large corporations and more evenly distributing them across companies of all sizes, right? Because it's very easy to see Intel, Cisco, your efforts inside the silo of one large corporation where it's very verticalized. You kind of have control over end to end in a lot of different ways. But the reality of international supply chain and logistics is so much of the flow of goods is dependent upon some bottleneck somewhere in the pipe, which ends up being sometimes a collection of very small players who may not have reached that point in their development. Now, just curious, what are you seeing in terms of what distribution was like at the beginning, what distribution is like now? What do you think it's going to be in 10 years?
Well,
Is it
the challenge
democratized is maybe the right word?
no, that's a perfect word. The challenges are exactly the same. Um, Now, unfortunately, because I'm so close to this, and this is what I've done pretty much for most of my life, I make certain assumptions that is missed by everybody else, and that's my fault. That's not their fault. Supply chains aren't chains; they're networks. They're communities of organisations, and particularly very large supply chains. You can have tens of thousands of companies involved in those supply chains, so that the guy at the top has no clue about the guy or girl down at the bottom or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They're very dynamic, particularly these days, particularly because of just in time or just in case is more appropriate there. Um, so the notion that there is this nice sort of linear flow that you can just map and then everything's fine. That's complete and utter fantasy. The
Looks good on a
other,
slide, though.
yeah, you tell me about the other challenge is that inside supply chains, because you've got so many participants, this notion that everybody understands what something is exactly the same is again fantasy, and that's actually impossible to enforce. A lot of companies have tried. So, say for example, I hold up a pen, right? So you can see this pen. I would call this a uniball. Someone else would say, well, that's a purple pen. Someone else would call it something else. Everybody's got their own definitions of the same thing. Now, inside a supply chain, that's reality, but it's also a disaster if you're trying to identify a piece of inventory in your supply chain. Is it the same thing? Are we talking about the same thing? And so on and so on and so on. So you end up with duplicates or triplicates, but it's actually the same thing just because people don't understand that. So context and identification is vital. Now, one of the biggest problems that we encountered back in the day, which is still a huge problem, the big players in a supply chain assume, well, they can define everything that's in the supply chain and everybody will follow their definitions. Well, not true. Because if let's say you're a major car manufacturer and you work with a major component supplier like Bosch, and you say to Bosch, well, we're the car manufacturer and therefore we're going to tell you what a brake disc should be referenced as. And they say, well, excuse me, but we're Bosch and we work for Mercedes Benz and they're a little bit bigger than you. And Mercedes Benz tell us it's XYZ. So we're going to go with their definition and you're going to have to change. So you end up with this disconnect throughout the supply chain. And therefore, This may be the only thing that Mark Zuckerberg has done which has been of value. When Facebook came on the scene, the notion of graphical databases started to take root, in the sense that rather than trying to use a hierarchical database to define what something is and through relationships, the graphical database does it through links and connections and whatever. And that's how you handle or try and address this issue of different references or different descriptions referring to the same thing. And 20 years ago, when we first encountered this, well, we actually encountered it for the first time in UPS when we were doing something for Rolls-Royce Aerospace, the jet engine manufacturer. But then we carried on and refined it and resolved it. Back then, this idea that you provide links to different things rather than trying to enforce one universal definition. So, given that that's the problem, or one of the biggest problems, when you're trying to define a solution that has to apply to a community, you've got to keep it as open and as flexible as possible. So where you get a network of parties involved in a supply chain outside of the siloed structure that you described earlier, that's the only way it works. You've got to view it as a community, a network, a web, really, so that you're able to identify things and understand the context of those things, which gives you proper visibility.
So there's been different levels of success in doing that. Some might say Amazon is a good example of quite a bit of success, maybe of blending those two ideas.
Yeah.
Because in some sense, what they started with is, well, if we capture and own enough of the demand for the goods, we could tell people whatever they're going to call whatever they're going to call.
Yeah.
But they also have built out quite the network of vendors, logistics services, etc. Who's doing the future well today?
Well, Amazon are deeply impressive. You have to say that where they started from. I actually met Jeff Bezos. He will never remember this. But back in tempted to say 99, something like that. One of my close friends is a lady called Esther Dyson. And
Yeah.
she was pretty influential back in the day. And she's a fantastic person and super, super bright. She's been very good to me. And she used to run these conferences where all the great and good and technology trends were identified very early on, and he was at one of those things. And I was still working for UPS then, so he wasn't that keen on a conversation with me because I suspect he had ideas in his mind as to what he was going to get up to. But starting as an online store for books, when they started to move out into infrastructure with Amazon Web Services, they have done a fantastic job. And there's a guy who works from Werner Vogels, who's a Dutch guy, and he's the designing mind behind their infrastructure. And what Amazon are, apart from being very efficient, very effective, they are actually an impressive organization based on the talent they've recruited to design what they do and the way that they operate the company. And I know there's lots of people that would disagree with that, but you have to, if you sort of stand back and see what they've done, how they've transformed the world and how they've transformed how people think about logistics, it's incredibly impressive. And one of the things a lot of startups fail to understand when they look at the logistics market and technology startups say, wow, we can do that much better, that little thing, that they tend to look at a small segment and it may be a real problem and they may come up with a fantastic solution for that problem. But then after a while, often a very short while, they work out that, oh, we have to share this with all these other bits. And, oh, maybe what we've done may be great in isolation, but as part of a holistic arena, then it doesn't work. And that's where a lot of them fail, because they don't understand the big picture. And that's easy to appreciate, because it's a very big picture, and some of these things are obscured, and so on and so on. So a lot of the startups that come in think that they've got a great point solution and may develop some brilliant technology to address that particular problem, unless it can operate in the context of the landscape as a whole, then that will be a challenge. So, and that's really what it comes down to. So, for example, visibility using an integrator's track and trace system, incredible. You can identify something anywhere in the world within the integrator system. Same for shipping lines and airlines. But the moment you have to connect, or the item goes outside that domain to someone else, you've got to have really, really tight and efficient integration, so that their monitoring platforms or visibility platforms or tracking platforms can share that data back to everybody else. And that's an easy thing to say, but it's very difficult to do, even now. Um, but that's where you get real visibility, when you're handling multiple shipments involving multiple parties across multiple time zones, and then with multiple languages involved.
Yeah.
And if you're dealing
multiple
with
dictionaries of jargon as well.
exactly, and break bulk and all the rest of it, it becomes a challenge. And some of the big visibility players now have spent a huge amount of money just learning how hard that is. So that's why this has been a challenge.
So we talked about Amazon, but I'm kind of curious, who do you think is doing the future well right now? Who, to your point, is seeing the big picture and might be doing something simple right now, but is focused on the right simple?
I'm not sure. I think to see that kind of thing, rather than identify specific companies, you've got to look at China, because a lot of the big logistics operators in China and the big platforms in China, um, they are doing some very, very, very innovative things around data and the user, to make it incredibly easy for the ultimate customer, which is someone sitting in a house or somewhere, or an apartment, and they see something on Alibaba or any of the other huge Chinese e-commerce platforms, and those operators that provide the logistics for those platforms, first off, they're in a unique situation because they're operating in China, and there's certain challenges to that. But they've also done a very good job about, instead of trying to automate everything, they only automate what they think makes sense. And if it still makes sense in terms of cost of operation to use a human, they use a human. But now you could get into all kinds of arguments about the cost of labor over there and all the rest of it, but that's not the point. What they have done is understood that every item has data around it, and collecting that data and being able to amalgamate that and hold it in context, so that you can identify the user, you can identify what it is, what they want, you can identify where it is, and you can have a pretty good go at how long it's going to take to get to them. And also, if there's a problem, reroute that dynamically to make sure that it gets to them. And it's not unlike an organization like UPS, where they see it as an act of failure if a shipment isn't delivered according to their promise, if you will. In China, it's the challenge is not, they don't really care whether the person's upset if it arrives or not. It's that if the person's upset, they'll go to a competitor, and that's really bad. So we have to make sure that we deliver on time. So you're seeing a lot of that, and they've done some stuff that a lot of it is not really visible in the West, in terms of using machine learning to try and predict certain things, and they're getting quite good at that. We're starting to do some of these experiments here in outside China, but because it's a closed market and almost like a giant petri dish over there, they can try a lot of these things. So things like there's this concept called live streaming. You may have been familiar or come across it where you are. Back in the day, it was known as sort of TV shopping, where you had these shopping channels on TV, particularly in the US in the 80s and 90s. Well, now it started to scale in China, where they're using the internet, where vendors would do these experiences which are live streamed. And all of a sudden, you'd have literally millions of people inside 5 minutes order something. Now, if you're a large logistics company and someone says to you, can you deal with suddenly a load of shipments at scale? Well, what do you mean at scale? Well, let's say 25,000, 50,000. Wow, that's a lot. Yeah, we can deal with that. We've got this massive infrastructure. Well, okay, this is 5 million. And at that point, they clutch their chest and fall on the floor. Because, but these logistics operations in China for these platforms, they can cope with that level of scale. And a friend of mine who owns a software business in Shanghai, um, he said he was talking to me about this about 18 months, 2 years ago, just before COVID kicked in. He said one of the biggest challenges they've found that their customers are saying to them, we need to be able to cope with live streaming sessions. Their customers are logistics companies, and they're saying our customers, which are the retailers and whatever, can we cope with this huge demand if they do a live stream of a particular product? So they had to do all kinds of things to be able to scale and manage that sort of demand that can, be there for a couple of hours a day, and then for the next 4 days, nothing. But you've got to, we say we're going to give you 1 day or 2 day delivery. You've got to cope with that. So it's challenges like that that's where I think the innovation is going to be seen.
So that strikes me as one of the, say, challenges and solutions where it really did require that a lot of ingredients were kind of already at hand in some way, shape, or form. Technology ingredients, physical operations ingredients, infrastructure ingredients. What is it about China, and what is it about, as you mentioned, that petri dish that has allowed it to be experimenting in this way versus other markets or other parts of the landscape?
Well, it's
What's the story that allowed those ingredients to get onto the chef's table?
well, one of the advantages the US has when they introduce new things is because it's such a vast domestic market. Same thing in China. It's a colossal domestic market. So they can experiment. And in logistics terms, they don't have to worry about some of the challenges of shipping internationally. It's just an issue of capacity versus, demand in a, I won't say a controlled environment, because if you've ever been to China, you realize how, apart from the obvious, how uncontrolled it is. but that if you try to do it across, let's say across Africa, for example, or the Middle East, that you couldn't do it. It would be impossible. So having, I won't say, having a homogeneous environment in which to experiment helps enormously. And when they first tried this, I'm sure they had huge problems, and there was loads of drama and God knows what else.
Yeah.
But they are able to learn very quickly and adapt. So the notion that as we have in the West, if someone turns around and says, "Right, you've got to do this now," yeah, but I was doing that yesterday. Do this or you're fired. That you can't do that in the environment certainly the environment that I come from. But over there, they can. And more to the point, though, people are more open-minded and they'll try it, because everyone's trying to get ahead. But I think that's the difference. This notion of how you scale, and one of the other, looking into the future, one of the other interesting challenges, global shipping, whether it's by sea, by air, or by road or rail or whatever it is, has always been pretty deterministic in the sense that if you look at the way those networks are established, they're all um, a lot of them are around the hub and spoke model because that's the most efficient way of moving things around. Some of the stuff is point to point, but it's because demand has been pretty consistent. So,
Yeah.
simplest example, um, Europe buys a lot of stuff from China. So, put very big ships on the China to Europe route because it gets made in China and it gets bought in Europe, the US, whatever. Thanks to the way the internet has transformed society, and as machine learning and artificial intelligence is applied to shopping experiences, retail experiences, for want of a better expression, recommendation engines are going to say, okay, so you're interested in this particular item, and it's, this is a bit esoteric and a bit weird. Um, we know there's, and I'm making this up, we know there's a really good company or artisan that's doing this in Kazakhstan or Tibet or somewhere. You want to order that? Yeah, fine. So all of a sudden, a logistics operator might find that where they imagined a particular amount of supply, China to Europe, on that route, and they've planned, I don't know, 10 years out for the vessels that they need to buy and the facilities they need to establish, that demand suddenly goes everywhere. So all of a sudden, you're being asked to support transport from anywhere on Earth to anywhere on Earth. And those models were never designed to support that. Now you've got the technology that can actually say, yeah, I understand that, and I can sort of map all that out. But the physical transportation, that's going to become more challenging, particularly in a world where you're trying to cut emissions. So I think that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I don't have a clue as to how that's going to be addressed, but that's the danger or the challenge that you're going to have if you've got an artificial intelligence system suddenly saying, I need to go and find this giraffe that's pink. Who's got a wooden giraffe that's pink somewhere on Earth? I can find it over there because everyone can now use the internet to show that they make giraffes that are pink. So, how we navigate through that as a society is going to be interesting, and that's going to have profound logistics implications.
I'm wondering. I'm wondering if it can kind of work both ways, because what you're stating is that demand is more widely distributed, and therefore you have to go point to point more often. Uh, and that's assuming that demand is generated based upon whatever, the whims that guide demand type of thing. But in a AI ML world where so much content can almost be generated on the fly, how much will inventory generate demand in the future by saying, why don't we put the product promotion that was just generated on demand on YouTube as the pink giraffe, because I got 2 million pink giraffes sitting in multiple warehouses here, there, and everywhere,
Yeah,
type of thing.
I'm absolutely sure that's going to happen. But this comes back to knowing where your inventory is and knowing what it is and the information
Yeah.
around. I'll give you an example of where that can be really challenging. Um, a major high-end manufacturing company, like really high-end, using exotic materials, inventory for them is a big deal because it costs a lot of money. And they had, this is a real example, they had a number of facilities and they thought they had a pretty good handle on how much inventory they had. And we were called in to check out if that's true. Now, companies, do stock checks all the time. Um, they had no idea how much they really had. They thought, and I'll make up a number now, they thought they had $15 million worth of inventory of a particular item. They actually had much, much, much more of that. The reason they didn't know that they had much, much more than that, because they thought all their inventory was in the locations they'd said it was in. But they forgot about the people on the production line and the manufacturing facilities And the guys said, well, just in case, because we had a shortage last week, I'll just keep a couple of these units back and shove them under the desk or corner.
Invisible buffer stock.
Yeah. And that, when we went back to the supply chain team and said, boys, we've got a bit of a surprise for you. And bearing in mind, a lot of this stuff was constrained material, so incredibly expensive. And they said, oh my God, this could have huge implications for the way we've stated our accounts. Because, we thought that
Oh,
that's
I wish I didn't know this now.
yeah, exactly. So that's why understanding inventory, which comes back to the point about context and referencing and all this kind of stuff, we did, duplicates or substitutes. That's a big challenge. Is this the same thing, or is it something that can do what this item did? So when you're trying to fulfill something, can I use something that does what this does, but it's not the same thing, or do I have to get something that's exactly what they want? These are the interesting things that surround how you understand and identify inventory. And once you do that, then the case that you mentioned earlier about, well, let's start feeding stuff into the channel because we know that we've got a lot of pink wooden giraffes. We can, that if you know that and you know where it is, then go for it. But so many companies don't, and that's probably the issue I have with a lot of the big visibility vendors. Um, Great, I think visibility is really important, as we've proven over the past hour or so that we've been talking. But the notion that you just go in and you can say, well, I can show you where stuff is analogous to a track and trace system, but without actually understanding what it is. And particularly in the context of a network where you've got different parties that understand information in a different way, or their ability to share that with you, particularly in real time. This is not trivial. And a lot of people look at the landscape and say, oh, this is trivial. It's just supercharged track and trace. No, it's not. This is hard. And it's interesting that UPS is starting to work out. And, I have to declare an interest because obviously an ex-employee and I'm still a shareholder. But what they've been trying to do for a while now is really smart, the way that they understand that this is about information and data flows as much as physical operations. And some of the things that we did 25 years ago, trying to work with systems in different companies but were all part of the same supply chain to try and fulfill a promise to a customer. How you integrate that together and understand the nature of the data going through that is not trivial, and it takes a while. But luckily, technology is getting to the state now where it's a hell of a lot easier than when we blundered around trying to do this.
Well, Ken, with just a minute left here, I usually like to ask any prediction you want to share, especially after this chat. Clearly, you're almost a historian of supply chain and logistics technology, maybe a wise sage on a number of the topics as well. But what do you think is going to come
Everyone gets
next?
wise if
Any
they're
predictions? Wise enough not to predict.
around. Yeah. Um, I it's sad actually. I think that for the next 10 or 15 years, what's going on in a geopolitical sense means that global supply chains are either not going to be sustainable the way they are now, or they'll become much more regional because of political overtones. Uh, Sensor technology, thanks to the billions of mobile phones that have now been manufactured, sensor technology is going to be everywhere and in everything, and that has got huge implications for network infrastructure. If you're a logistics company and you've got a pretty fancy system set up and you're using a cloud infrastructure, beware of the volume of sensor data that you could be challenged to accept.
Yeah.
Billions of data points now. So that's going to create big implications. Every item that's moving through a supply chain will be beeping or burping or whatever.
Yeah. And that's just step one of the problem. Now you got to do something with it once you've recorded it.
Yeah, is it of interest to you? Does it matter? And so on. So that's probably the biggest challenge that people are going to face over the next few years, and the fragmentation of supply chains.
Well, Ken, again, thank you. This has been another episode of Full of Ship with our guest, Ken Lyon of UPS fame, of virtual partners, of e-logistics. You name it, he's thought about it. So thank you for your time today. And I also say thank you on behalf of our listeners. I'm sure they'll enjoy.
Thanks. That was great.
Cheers.
Thank you for joining Kyle and his guest on the Full of Ship podcast. Be sure to subscribe and tune in next time as Kyle continues to demystify ocean carrier tracking with his future guests.